following content may contain visuals that are disturbing, graphic, or sensitive in nature. Viewer discretion is advised. This material is intended for mature audiences and may not be suitable for all viewers. Please exercise caution while watching, and if you find such content distressing, we recommend discontinuing viewing. This disclaimer is provided to ensure awareness and to prioritize viewer well-being.
Hello and welcome to this brand new edition of Global Lens on News9 Live with me, Neha Khanna. Our focus continues to be on the Israel-Hamas war. Well, the fragile truce between Israel and Hamas is over. After a 7-day pause in the fighting in Gaza, the war has resumed. The Israeli military said it resumed combat operations against Hamas, accusing the latter of violating the truce agreement by firing towards Israel. On Thursday, 8 more hostages were released from Gaza and 30 Palestinians freed from Israeli jails. During the temporary ceasefire, more than 100 Israeli hostages were released in exchange for 240 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. Many had hoped the truce would last longer, and Egyptian and Qatari negotiators were working to extend the temporary and uneasy truce for an additional 2 days. In fact, according to a statement from Qatar's foreign ministry, negotiations between Israel and Hamas are still continuing despite the resumption of hostilities. Remember, around 150 hostages are still being held in Gaza. The Qatar foreign ministry has also said the continued bombing of the Gaza Strip in the first hours after the end of the pause complicates mediation efforts and exacerbates the humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip. It has called on the international community to move quickly to stop the violence. Qatar has condemned any targeting or forced displacement of civilians in Gaza, but it seems the war may well be set to expand. The Israeli Defense Forces have dropped leaflets in the southern Gaza city of Khan Yunis, calling it a fighting zone and telling residents to evacuate immediately. During the fighting, prior to the truce, Israel had repeatedly told residents of northern Gaza to move south for their safety. The city of Khan Yunis is located south of that line. The United Nations has estimated that at least 946,000 internally displaced Gazans are currently in southern Gaza. That's almost 1 million Palestinians. IDF spokesperson Major Doron Spielman said today, now that the truce has expired, the Israeli Defense Forces are once again out to destroy Hamas. The Israel military's aim, he said, is to destroy the group so they can never commit an October 7-like crime in Israel again, and along the way bring our people home. Spielman said the military's targets remain Hamas strongholds, Hamas terrorists, and where they shot the rocket launchers. Sirens went off in Israel in the hour before the truce was due to expire this morning, warning of an incoming rocket which was intercepted. Sirens have continued in Israeli communities around Gaza since then. Accusing Hamas of not honoring the ceasefire, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the government of Israel is obliged to accomplish the targets of the fighting. Those targets are to release the hostages, to liquidate Hamas, and to ensure the citizens of Israel are never again threatened by an attack from Gaza. Both sides have blamed each other for the resumption of fighting. The Hamas-run Health Ministry in Gaza says dozens of people have been killed since the bombardment began. The Hamas attacks on Israel on the 7th of October killed 1,200 people, with around 240 others taken hostage. Since then, according to Gaza's Hamas-run Health Ministry, more than 14,800 Palestinians have been killed in Israel's retaliatory campaign, including about 6,000 children.
Welcome. Secretary and I had an opportunity to begin the discussion, and there are many issues that we want to talk about. So I want to express our appreciation for your support from the beginning, the President's, your personally, your delegation, and the war aims of eliminating Hamas and releasing, securing the release of our hostages. You've been very, very helpful. We appreciate it deeply. We'd like to talk to you about the next phase. So that's a summary of what we'd like to talk about and began talking about.
Israel again. Unfortunately, as we are meeting now, there are casualties in a serious terror attack in the entrance to Jerusalem, our capital. 2 terrorists have attacked innocent civilians waiting to be picked up to go on their day's work. And we have casualties, we have loss of life, and I would like to express my heartfelt condolences to the families and, of course, to pray for the swift recovery of the wounded. This is another example of the situation we're in, the endless war that we are fighting against terror organizations, especially Hamas, in these very complicated and challenging times. I thank you for coming here. As always, you've been expressing the support of the United States, the President, administration, and I must say on behalf of the American people at large, so I thank you very much. We are working and praying and demanding the immediate release of all the hostages, and I thank the United States of America for the immense work it is devoting to the release of the hostages. There are still around 150 hostages who are there in Hamas hands in Gaza.
This morning, after a 7-day hostage release pause, having failed to provide a list of more hostages for release, the Hamas army of terror in the Gaza Strip violated the terms of the agreed framework and launched rocket fire at Israeli communities. At 5:43 a.m., Hamas fired the first rocket from Gaza, and that rocket fire has since intensified, with sirens blaring across southern Israel all morning, including in communities that are still under mandatory evacuation orders and in those kibbutzim ethnically cleansed by Hamas during its campaign of systematic extermination on October 7th.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. This is my fourth visit to Israel since October 7th. And as you said, we're reminded yet again by the events in Jerusalem today of the threat from terrorism that Israel and Israelis face every single day. And like you, my heart goes out to the victims of this attack. I believe one person lost life, maybe as many as 3. We're thinking of them. We're thinking of their families, their loved ones, and we mourn their loss just as we mourn the loss of any innocent life. From day one, we have been focused relentlessly on trying to secure the release of hostages from Gaza and from Hamas. And we have seen over the last week the very positive development of hostages coming home, being reunited with their families, and that should continue today.
As the Israel-Hamas war resumes after the tenuous 7-day truce, let's take a look at what the ground situation is like in the beleaguered Gaza Strip, ground zero of this crippling war. The head of the UN's Palestine Relief Agency, the UN Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA, has warned that the resumed Israeli military assault in the overcrowded south of Gaza may compel many of the 1 million refugees, including 900,000 sheltering in UN buildings, to try and push over the border into Egypt. Following his visit to Gaza, Philippe Lazzarini has urged Israel to think through the consequences of an offensive in the south. In an interview to The Guardian, Lazzarini has said, and I quote, "We already have a staggering human tragedy. We are in a race against time, and already disease is becoming as much of a threat as the bombardment. The combined impact of the bombardment and the siege has already pushed people to the south. Now, if there is fighting there too, there is a higher likelihood that people might wish to flee further south and beyond the border." Lazzarini has emerged as one of the most outspoken UN humanitarian officials in recent weeks, urging Israel to abide by the rules of law and proportionality. Expressing concern about the impact of fighting in the south, he has described the area as completely overloaded after Israel urged civilians in the north of the territory to move south for their own safety. The UNRWA chief says the Gaza Strip was already known as being one of the most crowded places in the world, and now you have the majority of the population that has moved towards the south. So you have the almost complete concentration of the population in half the territory, an area that cannot support such a presence because of an enormous shortage of basic supplies, including water. It simply cannot cater to so many people. Remember, people from Gaza City in the north have been asked to go to the south because they were told the south would be safer. Yet, a large proportion have been killed in the south, he said. He goes on to say, we have 1 million people in UN installations, including 100,000 in the north. They come to seek protection, Their locations are known, and despite that, nearly 100 of these installations have been hit directly or indirectly. And this has led to the deaths, the killing of more than 200 people, and injuries to the tune of 900 at UN installations. Now we are told, or we hear, that people should move further southwest if the offensive takes place in Khan Yunis, but you cannot declare an area safe unilaterally in a war zone. When asked to comment on Israel's argument that an extended ceasefire would leave Hamas entrenched and Israel's security compromised, Lazzarini said Gaza is not Hamas. You have an organization called Hamas and you have a population, and this population is diverse, vibrant, and cannot be equated to Hamas. It's a population which has lived under the rule of Hamas over the last 17 years. Does it mean that the entire population, half of it are children, half of it were born after Hamas came to power, have to pay the price? It's an equation which has to be addressed by those who make the objective to neutralize or eliminate Hamas. What we are saying is that the objective cannot be at the expense of the civilian population. That is the reason why you have a rule of law, the reason why you have an international humanitarian law. The UNRWA chief has also urged Israel to think of its world standing, saying the longer this war lasts and the more people die in Gaza, there will be a very strong feeling in the region that international humanitarian law does not apply the same for everyone. The further the region will be polarized, and the further we will be from any peace prospect in the future. We should never ever underestimate this feeling, not just in Gaza but in the region. Lazzarini went on to say, imposing a siege on an entire population seems to me to be a collective punishment. The most difficult concept in international humanitarian law is the concept of proportionality, but we have to be careful not to use this notion to justify the unjustifiable. Personally, I don't see how we can justify through the concept of proportionality the killing of more than 15,000 people in 40 days, and among them so many women and children. I don't see how this can be justified through the concept of proportionality and self-defense. By any account, these are staggering figures, and it's a staggering human tragedy. Lazzarini has also pleaded for more than 200 trucks a day to be allowed to cross the Rafah crossing and for more crossings to be opened by Israel. Describing the abysmal and heart-wrenching conditions that Palestinians are currently living in, Lazzarini says, we're hosting 35,000 displaced people, and these people are living in just appalling, unsanitary living conditions. You have sewage water starting to pour into the courtyard of the compound. The doors of the compound were locked just like a closed prison because it cannot host more people. It was shocking. People arrived 30 to 40 days ago and had left everything behind. Most of them have seen their houses and apartments destroyed and are still living in the clothes in which they arrived 40 days ago. Lazzarini goes on to say, I talked to a father who burst into tears when he started to describe the living conditions and how he feels. His family are living in 4 square meters of space, sleeping on the concrete floor. They have no mattress, they have no blanket. They are struggling to have one meal a day, which is primarily canned food or a piece of bread. They are queuing up to get water. They are queuing up for hours to go to the toilets. This Palestinian man told Lazzarini, I feel humiliated, I feel stripped, we feel stripped of our dignity, we feel lost, we feel useless, we feel broken. And his story is a story of almost anyone living in Gaza today. That's what Lazzarini has said in this detailed interview. All right, let's now go across to our guests to understand where this war is now headed now that the 7-day fragile truce is over. Joining me on Global Lens tonight is Tammy Ben-Haim, Consul General of India to South India. She joins us live from Bengaluru. Also with us, Professor Orel Abulu at the School of Political Science, Government and International Affairs. He joins us live from Tel Aviv. And completing the panel tonight is our Indian guest, Major General Ashwini Sivaj, Defense and Geopolitical Expert. He joins us from New Delhi. Thank you very much to all three of you for joining me on the show. Tammy, welcome back. If I could start with you. There were many who were, of course, hoping that this 7-day truce would be extended. Qatar has in fact categorically stated that efforts were on to somehow get the truce extended, but it wasn't to be. Of course, both sides have blamed each other for the truce ending in the manner that it did. But one question that comes to mind is, what now happens to those close to 150 hostages who are still in Hamas's captivity in Gaza?
You're right. That is the question, or at least definitely one of the questions. But there's no two sides. The ceasefire was broken by the Hamas terrorists. They did not give the list like they were supposed to as part of the deal. They did not release the women, the mothers, the children they were supposed to. There's still two babies left hostages, a 4-year-old and a 10-month-old, their brothers, Orel and Kfir, and they're still there. Their mother is still there. Their father is still there. But according to the ceasefire agreement, around 10 hostages were supposed to be released each day, especially the mothers and the children, and families were not supposed to be taken apart. So Hamas today did not hand the list over. And they started, as we saw also in the newsreel that you showed, Hamas has started shooting rockets back into Israeli towns and villages. So that's definitely a breaking of a ceasefire. In the past few days as well, Hamas has exploded some explosive next to soldiers within Gaza, which is also a breaking of the ceasefire. But Israel was willing to forgo it. We didn't do anything because our main goal at the moment is to free the hostages. And this is what we're doing. And this is what we're fighting for. In addition, and again, you rightly mentioned, to make sure that Hamas cannot pose a threat to Israel, that there is no threat to Israel from the Gaza Strip. And not only is that atrocities like the October 7th massacre won't be repeated, but that any threat from Hamas terrorists from Gaza will not be made at Israel.
All right. Now, even as questions...
And we don't know. You were mentioning the condition of the people in Gaza, and war is very difficult. And in Israel and the IDF, the Israel Defense Force, is doing all that it can to minimize this. We now even have a digital map in Arabic for people where we break down each separate neighborhood and what other army in the world goes and tells the people, or goes and tell people in advance, please notice, we're going to be at this specific quadrant of the neighborhood tomorrow. Please leave if you need to, or please shelter in place. I really don't know who does this except for us. But again, you couldn't talk about the condition of the almost 150 hostages that are left, because the Hamas terrorists won't let the ICRC, the Red Cross, see them. They won't let anybody approach them. They won't say where they are. They're sending out, psychological warfare and lies, saying this person's dead, this person's alive, Israel killed this hostage, we don't have this hostage. They're playing games with all of our minds, with their lies, with their threats, with their psychological warfare. And, so we can talk about, and the conditions, we're doing all it can throughout the war. In addition to helping the civilians move, Israel has been allowing and has even been supplying itself water and humanitarian supplies. And during the ceasefire, around 200 trucks a day came in, including, by the way, with cooking oil, with fuel, with solar, and they even went to North Gaza. So I don't know how much more Israel can show that it will tolerate many things. It will do anything it can to help the people. It will, ignore some breaks in the ceasefire in order to get our hostages back. But if you're not releasing hostages, not releasing a list of names, not releasing babies that you've kidnapped, and firing rockets again into Israeli towns and villages, there isn't much choice but to, keep on attacking Hamas targets.
So, Tammy, let me ask you this question. For now, the war has resumed. And of course, we know Israel's stated objectives as far as this war is concerned. But Qatar and Egypt have said repeatedly that negotiations are still on, and they're still hopeful that perhaps there can be another ceasefire. If things do move in the right direction, would Israel be open to another truce of the kind that we've just had? Because like I said, one of your biggest concerns still remains the safety of those 150 hostages who are trapped in Gaza. And one has also heard reports about how Hamas claims that it may not actually have all of these 150 hostages in its captivity. Some reports suggest that some of them could be with the Islamic Jihad, some of the other allied groups, or again, who knows, maybe these are mind games that are being played. So are those concerns there as well, about where these hostages really are, whether Hamas does have all of them or not?
Of course, we're concerned about everything. We don't know if they're, God forbid, dead or how wounded or what their situation is, and if they're being left alone or being brutalized, and what their issues are. And you're right, all these, we don't know if what Hamas is saying is true or psychological warfare or trying to get something. But I think Israel has proven again and again, we're even releasing women and males under 18 who have committed and have been charged, most of them, with terror crimes, including, the fact that they didn't manage to kill the people they were trying to kill, but they went out and shot at citizens, being Jewish and being Israel in Israel. It's enough of a terror attack. It was by fate that these women who have been charged weren't charged with murder because the person didn't die. So we're even releasing terrorists in order to get these people back. And I think you're right. I think if, Qatar is in it, Egypt is playing a serious leadership role, the United States is in this negotiation as well. I'm sure if some plan, any plan, as we saw on Thursday, yesterday, only 8 hostages were released and we accepted it. We will do everything, and I think we've proven it again and again, to get these hostages, these people who were kidnapped, back into Israel.
Okay. Tammy, since you have to leave the show in a few minutes, I want to ask you another couple of questions before we let you go and before I move on to the other guests on the panel. There are many reports suggesting that the Israeli Defense Forces have been dropping leaflets in parts of southern Gaza, asking people to evacuate those areas. Now, there are many, including the UNRWA chief, who I quoted on the show a short while ago, who are asking the question that Israel asked Palestinians to move from the north to southern Gaza for their own safety. But now, if the war is going to expand from the north to the south as well, then what options are the Palestinian people left with? And we're obviously referring to civilians here. We're not talking about Hamas terrorists. What options would they really be left with as it is? As has been mentioned, at least 1 million of them are crammed into southern Gaza, which is not even able to cater to their needs. Once the war expands, which almost seems inevitable now, what happens to those people? Egypt is not even willing to take refugees.
One, let's see if the war expands and how. Even today, when we started targeting again Hamas, terrorist cells, headquarters, war weapon storage, we've targeted over 200 today, and all were in northern Gaza. Again, as I said, we not only drop leaflets, we also call people. There's a digital map they can use, and we assist them. We'll see where we get to what we get. But again, we're doing it. I told you, we took neighborhoods, we took areas, and the IDF divided it section by section. So they're going to know what section will be targeted. So there might be shifts within sections and not pushing all of them to the even more southern region or next to the Rafah crossing. So Israel is trying to do what it can. Again, these UN organizations have been known for years that Hamas is embedding itself in hospitals, within schools, some of their schools, within mosques. They knew what they were teaching the children. They knew about the summer camps, indoctrinating children to become terrorists. If you want, if they want to point figures and find the people to blame, Hamas is right there. They can call out to Hamas. They can also try to assist in finding the hostages and talking and saying what they need to say to the terrorist organization. We're doing everything we can. And of course, I can understand their plight. I can understand what they see before them. But it's very clear, we did not go in. We went. The only reason we're in Gaza at the moment, the only reason we're fighting, is that Hamas terrorists decided to attack us. They decided to attack us by air, by sea, by land. As you yourself, they massacred over 1,200 people. They kidnapped 239 people. They raped, they tortured, they murdered. We don't know what they're doing now. And even today, they have, the gall or the ability even to shoot rockets back into our towns while holding our hostages. So in this scenario, Israel is doing what it has to do to free its citizens and make sure that the rest who are within Israeli territory are safe.
Okay. Final question, Tammy, before we let you go. Several reports in recent weeks have suggested that certain members of the Netanyahu government were quite unhappy with the truce agreement in the first place. At least individuals like Ben Gvir and perhaps even the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, who thought that perhaps, Israel was giving too much to Hamas. And it is believed that Prime Minister Netanyahu was under pressure to resume the war, even though I know that you said that it is Hamas which violated the terms of this truce. But that apart, the question I want to ask you is that if Qatar, Egypt and the United States are able to broker another truce of the kind we've seen in the last few days, if Hamas does agree to return the remaining hostages, then would Prime Minister Netanyahu be open to another ceasefire, even if there is pressure from some members of his cabinet to continue with the war relentlessly?
Yeah, democracy is the best thing we have, but it's not perfect, is it? Obviously, in coalition governments, there's pressure. But again, there was even pressure not to go into this current ceasefire. And once we had an opportunity to save some of the hostages, and there's a saying in Judaism, which is very lovely, that says, if you saved one soul, you saved the entire world. So the moment there was an actual real chance, and as you said, especially Egypt and the US stood behind it, we took it with both hands and we did everything that was required of us. And so again, let them come with the deal. They are talking, we're hoping they're talking. Our president, the president of Israel, is today in Dubai for the COP, for the environmental, international conference. I don't know what's going on. We can all hope that this is what's going on. We can all hope that they find some way to free the babies, the children, the women, and definitely the men and the elderly, by the way, who are still being held hostage with no idea whatsoever about their fates and about how they are.
All right. Here's certainly hoping that all the hostages do return home safely. And of course, the world does want to see an end to this war at the earliest. Just too many people have suffered on both sides. On that note, Tammy Ben-Haim, thank you so much for joining me on Global Lens.
Thank you.
All right, let me now go across to our other guests, Professor Orel Abulu and Major General Ashwini Sivaj. My apologies for keeping you waiting. Professor Abulu, starting with you, the 7-day truce held. Many hostages were released, many Palestinian prisoners were set free in exchange. Now the war has resumed. Qatar, Egypt still insist that efforts are on to mediate yet another truce. Do you believe another truce could in fact be in the works? Because as I asked Tammy, there are still at least 150 hostages who are trapped in Gaza. And then, of course, let's not forget about the suffering of the Palestinian people. All that the world wants to see is a ceasefire. Do you see something like that perhaps working out again in the next few days?
I think it's possible. I'm not sure it's likely, but it is certainly possible because the interest of all parties in one way or another converge around the possibility, at least, of another round or several rounds of a ceasefire. All the parties have a certain interest in the matter, certainly Qatar and Egypt, but also Israel and Hamas. The question, of course, is to what extent Hamas can actually deliver the hostages and to what extent is in a capacity to actually rule what is going on in the Gaza Strip in order to provide Israel what Israel seeks. And that is becoming highly doubtful because Hamas apparently distributed the many hostages that it took on October 7th among other factions in the Gaza Strips and even families. To what extent Hamas can actually retrieve all of them is a big question mark. And of course, Hamas is trying under Sinwar to conduct an ongoing mind game, as you said, with Israel. It's also very much a psychological warfare, the goal of which is in one way or another to humiliate Israel. And that will continue to be the attempt by Hamas, beyond, of course, to continue its rule in Gaza and to a certain extent extend it into the West Bank and beyond that. Because let's not forget, the overall goal of Hamas, very explicit in practice as well, is the eradication of Israel as a state.
Okay. Major General Sivaj, let me come to you now. How do you see this war progressing? Of course, most countries around the world want to see at least another temporary truce, if not a complete ceasefire, because that would mean relief for the Palestinians who've been suffering, and that would mean release of more hostages. Do you see that happening in the days ahead? Because it certainly seems like Qatar, Egypt and the United States have been working round the clock towards that. There were many who were hoping that perhaps today itself we would have an extension of the truce, but it wasn't to be, and fighting has now resumed. And there is the other factor that I mentioned to Tammy, the fact that there are many in the Netanyahu government who did not want even a temporary truce in the first place. Keeping all these factors in mind, how do you think Israel is likely to proceed with this war in the days ahead, and how open is it likely to be to another truce?
Yeah, Neha, the first and foremost is what are the military objective of Israel? They were twofold. One was to destroy the complete military infrastructure and the capability of Hamas, and second was to get the hostage released from the Hamas custody. Now, having said so, that when basically Israel has gone all out to now diminish and destroy the capability and capacity of Hamas, has it done it completely before they agreed for humanitarian pause? Obviously not. It was only 60 to 70%. There's another 30 to 40% capability still intact of Hamas. So was it militarily advised to have the pause? If you see it from the military point of view, it wasn't a wise step to have a military pause, because you are giving an opportunity to Hamas to recoup, reorganize and refit, because they were on a back foot and they were not having any fuel. Their diesel generator was not working in tunnel. It was difficult for them to stay there, and they were desperate that there should be some sort of humanitarian pause so that they can reorganize themselves. However, because Netanyahu came under pressure, it was also a domestic pressure, because you have to get the hostages back, and also international pressure which was there, because what was happening is, as this war prolonged, whatever 7th October was there, people have forgotten what Hamas had done to Israel, but now they are remembering how much casualties are taking of civilians in Palestine. So therefore, there was one can say a world opinion going against Israel, and therefore the Israel was under tremendous pressure, especially Netanyahu domestically, to get the hostage release, and also from the international community, that in the first place they agreed for humanitarian pause. Now, as far as the humanitarian pause is concerned, it benefited Hamas more than Israel, because Israel also tried to refine its strategy and also get the intelligence. But certainly that it has not worked that well for Israel also for getting hostages, because there are 160 hostages still there with Israel. Israel is still there with Hamas, and Hamas will use them as a bargaining chip. Hamas is not going to kill now anyone which is alive with Hamas, but certainly they will use it in the long run. But they haven't given the children, they have not given the babies, and they are now trying to make use of it for the future. Now, whether Israel will agree for the second humanitarian pause, to me it looks like that, yes, it is possible. The reason is simple, because there is heavy pressure within the Israel itself that the leftover hostages must be brought back. And I suppose that will work out. And also, the America wants the ceasefire to take place. Egypt and Qatar is also working. I suppose that in very near future, there is a chance of a second humanitarian pause taking place, because the casualties are going to be huge in the southern Gaza. Because the moment this firing takes place in southern Gaza, the density of population is 4 times more than London. These are 23 lakh people which are now there in southern Gaza. Though it may be that Yahya Sinwar is also there, but the moment the firing takes place in South Gaza, you will find it heavy casualty of Palestine. So therefore, I suppose if Qatar, Egypt and US put pressure and it work out, in case Hamas also ready to negotiate as far as the hostages are concerned, ready to release the women and children, I suppose there is a chance of having a second military pause or second humanitarian pause, though militarily not advisable as far as Israel is concerned, but from the humanitarian point of view and also for his domestic politics, Netanyahu will agree.
Okay, you're saying Netanyahu will agree if such an agreement were to be reached. Let me go back to Professor Abulu for this point. Professor Abulu, we've discussed this before, but I have to ask you this question again. Recent developments seem to suggest that Israel will expand its war from the north to the south. It's not even been denied by the Israeli Defense Forces. We know about the leaflets that have been dropped. So the question that many, including the UNRWA chief, are asking is that Israel itself had asked Palestinians to move from the north to southern Gaza for their own safety. And now when you have more than 1 million people, cramped in that little space, half the territory, where do they go from there if that area is also going to come under bombardment?
Right, the plan as it stands at the moment, as Tami told you, is that citizens or inhabitants of Gaza will be able to relocate from one neighborhood to the next in order to save as many civilian lives as possible when the IDF gets into that specific neighborhood and try to target Hamas. It's going to be incredibly hard, incredibly hard. Obviously, there is no perfect war, so to speak, but what has been going on in Gaza is atrocious in that regard, with Hamas using 2.5 million Palestinians as effectively human shield. How to conduct such a war and still be able to defeat Hamas as a military political organization while minimizing civilian life, the cost of civilian life is an immense challenge. And here, of course, there is a tremendous role for the UN and other agencies, but especially the UN. And before you started with the interview, you provided some key lines from the statement made by the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. We should all bear in mind that to a certain extent, what we are witnessing in Gaza, not just Gaza, in the West Bank as well, but mainly in Gaza, is a tremendous failure on the part of the UN. Right? The UN has been working at that for 70 years, trying to aid Palestinian refugees. The main goal of all UN agencies when it comes to refugees is to rescue them from the position of being refugees. The UN has failed at that task, and it's interesting to compare between the UN treatment of the refugees worldwide and that of the Palestinians. We have about 70 million refugees worldwide that the UN is taking care of. We have over 5 million Palestinian refugees. But when it comes to the actual workers, there are about 16,000 who are dealing with all the refugees worldwide, and double that number, more than 30,000 UN employees for Palestinian refugees. And still now, 70 years after that, no end in sight. And it's, to a certain extent, a perpetuating machinery of the UN. And this is highly unfortunate. And as I told you in the previous interview that we've had, I think that the military operation can never succeed if there is no political effort, a concerted political effort on the part of all moderate parties in the region and the international community. Otherwise, this horrible war will be just another round of something that may well become even worse than what we see at the moment. Bear in mind, we had no second front in Lebanon, not substantial second front, and the West Bank as well. But there are many, both in the northern part and in the eastern part, in the West Bank, who are just awaiting for the opportunity to join in the fight. And we've just heard about the terror attack that was in Jerusalem yesterday. This is the stakes that we're now facing. A truly all-out war that can become regional and potentially international. And I don't see enough of political effort, beyond the military calculation, political effort in order to make things better. Now is the time to do it. It was the time even before that. We're almost 2 months in the war. But there's certainly not a moment to lose in order to make this political effort for coexistence, even perhaps peace.
Nobody could disagree with you on that. But, you know, I want to read out some quotes from this interview that the UNRWA chief has given. And I'd like the thoughts of both my guests on this, starting with you, Professor Abulu. I'm quoting Philippe Lazzarini, the chief of UNRWA, who says, Gaza is not Hamas. You have an organization called Hamas, and you have a population which is diverse, vibrant, and cannot be equated to Hamas. It's a population that has lived under the rule of Hamas for over 17 years. Does it mean that the entire population, half of it are children, half of it were born after Hamas came to power, have to pay the price? He then goes on to say the longer this war lasts and the more people die in Gaza, there will be a very strong feeling in the region that international humanitarian law does not apply equally to everyone. The further the region will be polarized and the further will we be from any peace prospect in the future. He says imposing a siege on an entire population seems like a collective punishment, and let's not underestimate what impact this could have, not just in Gaza, but in fact in the entire region. The resentment that is growing, we should never underestimate this feeling, he says. Your thoughts, Professor Abulu?
Well, he's absolutely right that Hamas is not Gaza and Gaza is not Hamas. But it is precisely this distinction that he emphasizes at the beginning that he loses sight of later on. Because it should be the goal of UN agencies, various UN agencies, to emphasize that distinction and target Hamas as well, like Israel does, like the US does, like many moderate armed regimes do. Although in terms of their public expressions, they are trying to tame it down. All the moderates of the region and the international community would like to see Hamas gone, and for good reasons. Moreover, overwhelming majority of Palestinians before October 7 were against Hamas breaking the ceasefire that was before October 7. Now, instead of helping the overwhelming majority of Palestinians fight against Hamas, too often, various UN agencies and other international actors are in one way or another helping Hamas, even if not intentionally. That is often the end conclusion of it. And I think this is the time to unite everyone, every moderate actors in the region and the international community in order to fight Hamas, but also, again, to outline a vision for the future. And yes, it is somewhat obvious, but there are concrete measures that can be taken. Look, the ultimate goal should be that there will be no UN agency for Palestinian refugees, because there will be no Palestinian refugees. There will be a settlement in which there will be a Palestinian state that every Palestinians can become citizens of, whether they are in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, or beyond that, right, in Lebanon, Syria, that they can immigrate to Palestine and become citizens in that state. But the UN does not do what it needs to do, both normatively, morally, and practically, in order to bring about that day, in order to help bring about the day. Obviously, it's not only up to the UN.
You know, I was going to say that I don't disagree that the UN as an international body that is expected to maintain peace seems to have completely failed, frankly, in many of its goals and objectives. But at the same time, we have to remember that it is not the United Nations which is fighting this war. It's not the UN which killed the Israelis on the 7th of October, or which has been killing all these Palestinians in the last 50 to 55 days. Since I'm running out of time, Major General Ashwini Savaj, very quickly, sir, your thoughts on what the UN RWA chief has said, because it does make sense. He says, remember, the longer this war lasts, the more people die in Gaza, the further away we will be from any peace prospect, because there will be that anger, angst, outrage and resentment, he says, not just in Gaza, but in the entire region. Do not underestimate it.
Absolutely. No doubt about it. Whatever the commissioner has said seemingly is right. But there is no other alternative as far as Israel is concerned. What has happened on 7th October was a terrorist action done by Hamas. And until unless Hamas is not totally completed, Israel will always feel unsafe. 7th October can be repeated again. So now to destroy Hamas, it has no other choice but to go to north-south Gaza. But unfortunately, what is happening is Hamas is making use of the Palestinian population. It is using them as a human shield. And that is where the casualties are taking place. The Hamas is making use of mosque, school, and as well as hospital at its operation command center, logistic build-up, as well as the ammunition center. Now, the point which comes is, how do they go after Hamas, which is already intermingled with the Palestinian? There has to be some mechanism, and in doing that, you will find that Palestinian civilian casualty will be there. And Hamas do not represent Palestine. Hamas is not interested in the welfare of Palestine. It is a terrorist organization. Now the question comes is that if this war continues for too long, the gap will increase, because what is happening the world over, there is a concern about the Palestinian, casualty of civilian, and therefore it is disadvantage to Israel. I fully agree with that. And as the war goes on, the gap between the Israel and also the neighboring state will increase. Now we were finding that of late, the Israel was coming very close to Muslim world. There was the Abraham Accord, U2, I2, and there was also India, Middle East, Europe corridor. And therefore,
but that seems to have been derailed by this war.
Derailed.
You're right.
It will be derailed. Now,
Fact
this
of the
is
matter
the biggest
is that
outcome of this. So my point, Neha,
yes,
unfortunately, there is no other choice with Israel, but bound to happen this way. You will find it, everything which was to happen economically in this area will go back by another 10 years. And you will find the Muslim world will be having a sort of grudge against Israel, and the Israel, when it was coming very close to even Saudi, UAE, Oman, Jordan,
how do you end this vicious cycle? This is a vicious cycle that we're talking about, and the situation just keeps getting worse and worse. And those who say that we're moving further and further away from any peaceful resolution have a valid point, because the more people are going to die, the more anguish and resentment there will be, which could last a very, very long time. But anyway, gentlemen, I'm completely out of time on this show. Thank you so much for joining me on Global Lens. Of course, this war is not ending anytime soon, unfortunately. I look forward to having both of you back on the show. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Neha.
Thank you.
All right, from the Israel-Hamas war, let's now turn our attention to a major event that's taking place in Dubai, the COP28 Climate Summit. Prime Minister Narendra Modi today called on all nations to work together to cut global emissions drastically and announced a green credit initiative that focuses on creating carbon skins with people's participation. At the COP28 Climate Summit in Dubai, Prime Minister Modi said India's emissions are very low compared to other nations whose population is much less. Referring to the nationally determined contribution, a climate action plan to cut emissions and adapt to climate impacts, Prime Minister Modi said India's population is 17% of the global population, but in global carbon emissions, India is only at 4%. We're moving fast in achieving the NDC targets. In fact, we reached our non-fossil fuel targets 9 years before the deadline. The Prime Minister said we don't have much time to correct the mistakes of the last century and asked every nation to work sincerely to meeting their NDC targets. The Conference of Parties is a decision-making body that reviews the implementation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. India's Environment Ministry has introduced 2 initiatives that indicate India's proactive approach to tackling climate change and promote sustainability. Life or Lifestyle for Environment movement was announced by Prime Minister Modi in 2021. The Green Credit Initiative seeks to encourage environmentally friendly practices rooted in tradition and conservation, reflecting the ideas of the LIFE concept. India is among a handful of countries on track to achieve its NDCs to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Prime Minister Modi was the only leader, in fact, to join the opening plenary along with COP28 President Sultan Al Jaber and UN Climate Change President Simon Stiell. He called for maintaining a balance between mitigation and adaptation and said energy transition across the world must be just and inclusive. Prime Minister Modi also called for rich countries to transfer technology to help emerging economies fight climate change. Listen in.
17% आबादी होने के बावजूद ग्लोबल कार्बन एमिशंस में हमारी हिस्सेदारी ओनली 4% से भी कम है। भारत विश्व की उन कुछ इकोनॉमीज में से एक है जो एनडीसी टारगेट्स को पूरा करने की राह पर है। एमिशंस इंटेंसिटी संबंधी टारगेट्स को हमने 11 साल पहले ही हासिल कर लिया है। नॉन फॉसिल फ्यूल टारगेट्स को हम निर्धारित समय से 9 साल पहले ही प्राप्त कर चुके हैं और भारत ने इतने पर ही नहीं रुके हैं। हमारा लक्ष्य 2030 तक एमिशंस इंटेंसिफाई को 45% घटाना है। हमने तय किया है कि नॉन फॉसिल फ्यूल का शेयर हम बढ़ाकर 50% करेंगे और हम 2070 तक नेट जीरो के लक्ष्य की तरफ भी बढ़ते रहेंगे।
Well, that's all the time we have on this Friday edition of Global Lens. Thanks so much for watching. Do join us again at the same time on Monday. Have a great weekend ahead.
Hello everyone, Namaskar, I'm music composer Ricky Cage. 3-time Grammy Award winner and a United Nations Goodwill